Hello and welcome to another installment of Introduction to Operating Systems and Virtualization. My name is Scott Neal. I'm not on location this week, but still wanted to take time out to give you Lesson 5. We're going to be focusing today on bare metal systems, the benefits of bare metal systems, and we're going to be talking about VMware Tools. And last but not least, we'll be looking at some general optimization strategies for Windows virtual machines. If you're following along in the book, we're going to be kind of augmenting the material in the Chapter 5 of your book this week. So, what is a bare metal machine? Well, a bare metal machine, quite simply, is a physical machine in the physical world without an operating system. Sometimes we, in the virtual world, would want to create a virtual machine without an operating system as well. There are a couple strategies for that. So maybe I've created a VM that I'm going to be using as a template. We're going to be installing a wide variety of operating systems on that template as we go. So that may be one instance where we want to build a virtual machine without an operating system installed. We may also want to build a virtual machine without an operating system. We don't even want to put a disk on it at all. This is optimal if I'm going to be, say, migrating or virtualizing a hard disk later on from another machine, and then I'm going to add that to another machine, to my VM later on. So maybe I'm getting ready to decommission some sort of server somewhere. And I don't want to build another physical server. I want to instead connect it or add it to a machine that I'm going to be running in my server infrastructure on my virtual, like in Hyper-V. So I may opt to virtualize that hard disk and create a virtual disk with that information on it, and then import that into my VM after I've already created the VM. So that is another option that is available to us. In order to do that, though, I would have to have a bare metal machine with no operating system on it, assuming, of course, that I'm going to have the operating system on the virtualized hard disk, and then I will import that in. Later on in the lectures, when we do some of the how-to segments, you'll see us import a virtual disk, perhaps in a Hyper-V environment. Essentially, whenever you're building a VM without an operating system, you're really building a virtual representation of a bare metal physical box. Therefore, the strategies for putting an operating system on that virtual machine are going to be pretty much identical to adding an operating system to a bare metal box that you would get from Dell or HP or even Gateway. For instance, if you don't have that virtual disk available, you can always create a VM disk later on and then import it in. Or if I decide to, tomorrow or next week, I decide on what operating system I want for that virtual machine, I can already have it pre-configured with the hardware settings that I want, and then just use a CD or an ISO file to complete the installation process. Once I've made that decision, then the installation of the operating system is pretty much a simple thing to do. And here you see that this is in VMware, or this VMware player, VMware workstation, pretty much identical. I do have 3 options available to me. In earlier how-to segment, we did a installation option of Windows Server 2012, I believe, using an install disk. That's certainly one of the options. We also have the option of using an ISO or disk image file. But last, at the very bottom, and often overlooked, is this option to install the operating system later. And that's just going to create a virtual machine with a blank hard disk. Alright, so just as a reminder, when you do build your virtual machine, you need to be aware, if you don't, just as a reminder from the last lecture, that the hardware settings for your virtual machine are going to be different from the hardware settings on your host machine. So in this virtual machine settings screen here, we can see that even though my physical machine has several gigs of hard drive space, several terabytes of hard drive space actually, that you're only seeing 60 gigs of hard drive space because that is what we have configured our virtual machine to have. That is a completely configurable option, and later on, of course, we can add as many hard disks to this machine as we want, but ultimately we need to be aware that the Windows VM, and particularly the Windows installation process, is only going to see what has been allocated to the virtual machine. So in this instance, I have 60 gigs of hard drive space, 1 gigabyte memory, pretty much the standard default for a VMware system build. Likewise, as I said, we can make reconfigurations of our hardware resources on the virtual machine, provided, of course, that they do not exceed the requirements of the host. Particularly in memory, memory is one of the most configurable options that will make the biggest difference in the performance of your box. So, just a reminder that configuring hardware options generally is a much more rapid reconfiguration process than doing it on a physical box, and adding resources is just going to take minutes instead of days or longer that you would need on a physical representation of that operating system. VMware Tools. VMware Tools are available if we're using VMware products. They are designed to enhance the user experience. They will improve the overall performance and help manage the virtual machine. There are, of course, other vendor hypervisor solutions that have similar enhancement packages, and we'll look at some of those later. But since right now we're focusing on VMware, we're going to be looking at VMware Tools. It is recommended, by the way, for all virtual machines that you create in VMware, whether it's VMware Workstation or VMware Player. For instance, installing the VMware Tools SVGA driver will significantly improve the graphics performance of the virtual machine. Likewise, VMware Tools will provide support for shared folders as well as for drag and drop operations with the host, making the movable data between the host and the VM seamless and extremely convenient. This is an option that's available that really is one of the great features in VMware. Another reason why we want to install VMware Tools, it does allow for synchronization of time between the guest operating system and the time on the host. This is particularly important for things like maybe you're running a domain environment, and everybody knows if in domains that time synchronization is one of those security features where if you have a difference in time, you can become untrusted on the network and so on. So time synchronization, another benefit. Also, VMware Tools supports automatic grabbing and releasing of the mouse cursor, copying, pasting between the guest and host, and improved mouse performance on a lot of the guest operating systems. So VMware Tools overall does perform a significant amount of enhanced flexibility characteristics to the VM. Once we install our operating system, whether we have installed it as part of the original virtual machine build, whether we have decided to install a Windows operating system on a virtual machine after we have built it and we've added it as an addition, ultimately once we build a Windows environment, and particularly this would be Windows 10, we need to start thinking about optimizing Windows for whatever purpose that we're using it for. Historically, Windows, particularly the older versions of Windows, certainly Windows 3.1, Windows 95, I would say all the way through Windows XP, really Windows was considered a very unsafe operating system. When you put Windows onto a machine out of the box, the makers of Windows, Microsoft, really was concerned about making sure the product worked out of the box for the user. They assumed that the user had a certain minimum level of technical experience and know-how about how to configure operating systems, and therefore their solution was just turn everything on. And that way when you installed it, it would pretty much work with just about any kind of environment. They have gotten better with that in the later versions of operating systems, particularly in Windows 10. The services are a little bit more locked down than they were in previous editions of Windows, but we still have a lot of tweaking that we can do. Turning on everything and building the operating system and with everything on already really is resource intensive and creates a very, very large security footprint. So as administrators, we're going to be thinking about how we can reduce that overhead and further make our box more efficient, as well as reducing that security footprint. We've talked about some other strategies for that already, but this is certainly one of the biggest strategies, is optimizing the Windows environment. Some processes that run in Windows, even in Windows 10, are not necessary in a virtual environment. Removing them can save you a lot of processing and memory resources. So we'll talk about some of those in a little bit. Optimizing the Windows environment also is going to reduce that security footprint. As I said before, it's going to make it much safer, and it's going to make it more focused on the task at hand that you have set up that box for. So what are some of the things we can optimize? Well, let's start with privacy settings. You know, Windows 10 divulges a great deal of information about the users. So this is kind of for two reasons, really. One is to enhance the user experience. So with Cortana and other tools that are constantly intuitive, listening to what you're doing, they have the ability to become very intuitive to your needs, and they learn as they grow and can assist you with a lot of things. The other hand, though, Microsoft makes no bones about the fact that they're using this knowledge that they're gaining from you for economic gain. So it's important to realize that, particularly enterprise environments, where people are going to be discussing and using sensitive information on a routine basis, that these tools are constantly listening 24/7 all the time, storing that information on Microsoft servers, and then that information is being data mined to learn all it can about you, either for the purpose of distributing advertising or, who knows what will end up happening with that information later on in life. So, generally speaking, it's probably a pretty good idea to turn off or reduce the privacy settings as much as possible. We can do this under settings. There's a setting called privacy settings, and there's probably, 12 to 14 different types of items that we can adjust. It's important to go in and ensure that each category is going to be optimized for our best privacy options. More often than not, that means disabling things like Cortana, background apps, and things like that, to make sure that unwanted information is not being disseminated to parties that we do not want. What are some other things that we can look at? Well, we can optimize the apps and features on the system. If we can go under the system tools, we can see under display that there are lots of apps that are probably being unused by most users. Those apps include food and drink, travel, health and fitness, money, news, sports, clocks, and so on. There are, a dozen different things here that most users, particularly in an enterprise environment, have no use for. All of these things eat up resources, and by disabling, getting rid of these things, uninstalling them, we can recapture those resources for better purposes. We can also go in and tweak some other options. For instance, did you know that Windows 10 servers act as an update server? So if you have a Windows 10 box, whether it's a desktop or server infrastructure, it's capturing updates, and it's trying to disseminate those updates to other systems. That eats up bandwidth, and it eats up resources. We can turn this feature off if we go into the settings in the start menu. Under search for updates, we can look under the update and security features, and under the Windows update, we can open the advanced options tool and then look for something that says choose how updates are installed, and then select choose how updates are delivered. So it's pretty far down in here, but I do have to have the ability here that I can toggle that on and off as I see fit, and when I toggle this off, where it says disable under the updated for more than one place option, that's going to disable this whole concept of the bits being distributed back and forth between machines, and that's going to reduce the bandwidth on my network as well as reduce the overall resources that my network boxes are using. I can also go in and look at and disable or even delete the unneeded startup items. Ever since Windows 8 came out, Windows 8 and Windows 10 have their startup applications available in the Task Manager. Prior to Windows 8, both the startup applications as well as startup services were available through msconfig through the Run menu. So if you type Run and do msconfig, you will still be able to pull up those startup services as well as some other startup options for your machine. However, the startup applications are in Task Manager. There are lots of programs, shortcuts, folders, drivers that are set to run automatically at startup when the user signs into Windows. It's important to go in and look at those periodically from time to time, see if they are relevant to your particular users, and disable or remove those items which are not. Disabling and deleting from the startup menu is going to improve startup time. It's going to reduce the amount of system resources that are being utilized, and therefore recapturing those resources. And you also might want to think about malware, because a lot of malware likes to use startup items, whether it's startup services or startup applications, to install itself every time Windows starts. So a good practice, if you suspect your machine is running poorly, you may suspect malware, is to look at these two areas as well and see if you can identify some unfamiliar items that bear some further research. I can, since we're on the topic of services, what is a service? Well, it is an application type. It's going to run in the system background. Typically doesn't have a user interface. All applications run in conjunction with some sort of service or a group of services on the system. Windows historically allowed a lot of unused services to run in the background. Part of that, we like to be user-friendly. We want to make sure it runs for our users. And even today, there are still some services that eat up resources and are typically not used by most users. If we go into the services tool, we described one way we could do that, but we can also do Windows plus R and then type in the Run dialog box, just type services.msc. That's going to open up the services snap-in utility, and we can go through that snap-in utility and look for any service that's currently being unused that we're not using on that system, and if it's in the state of running, we can simply tap on it, select stop, wait for it to stop, and then choose to disable it, further preventing it from coming back on at a later time. Be advised that you want to be sure to do this only for services that you are familiar with. If you don't know what the services is that you're getting ready to manipulate, the best thing to do is research it, figure out what it belongs to, and then make a decision whether or not you need it on the system. You do not want to, say, disable a critical system service that will prevent the system from starting. So what services can you disable? Well, Hyper-V services. Unless you're taking this course, you probably don't need Hyper-V services unless you're running some sort of virtualized desktop environment for your users. If so, congratulations. But for most users, you can disable all Hyper-V services. Fax services, yes, believe it or not, fax services is still enabled by default in Microsoft environments. You can disable that, as well as the Microsoft Windows SMS router, the diagnostics tracking service, and most people are not aware that Windows does come with its own keylogger program, essentially. It's called DMWAP Push Service. It's spelled DMWAPPUSH-SVC. You can disable that as well, not only from a resource perspective, but also from a privacy perspective. I'm not exactly sure what it uses that for. Retail demo services, sensor services, and since, don't forget, Windows 10 is a cross-platform operating system, you are going to find some Xbox services in there. Chances are you don't have any use for those. What else can I optimize? Well, for those IE users, Internet Explorer users out there, as well as any other browser really this applies, you can go in and disable any unused add-on or toolbar. Periodically, things like to install, and sometimes the user gets careless and accidentally installs some additional toolbars or add-ons that they really don't need, potentially create unwanted actions on the system. Going in and typically, routinely disabling or removing these not only will improve the performance and privacy of the box, but it's going to also make the user a lot happier because the browser will work a lot better. You're going to want to keep your file index either enabled and updated, or you're going to want to disable that index altogether. The index is designed for your file system to really improve search times on the system. The unfortunate truth is that most of the time the index is not updated routinely enough to make this feature useful for most users. My suggestion, disable it altogether unless you're going to be committed to updating it on a routine basis. I also, speaking of obnoxious things, I also do not like to have notifications show up on my screen, or at least not for a minute or a minute and a half. I have the ability to adjust the length of times of notifications. So this is one of those features that many users may be thankful that you know how to fix. And you can go in, if you go into the Settings app, and you can find something called the Ease of Access, this little icon. Click on the Ease of Access icon, and then choose Other Options on the left side. And then you have the ability to show how long you want different types of notifications in the drop-down menu on the right-hand side to show up for. This ranges from over a minute to none at all. So really another nice little tweak for you if you choose to use it. Another thing that can be very beneficial is disabling the OneDrive. A lot of users do not use their OneDrive. OneDrive, of course, is available by having a Microsoft account. Hotmail, Live, Outlook, they all come with OneDrive now, which is really a cloud storage utility. A lot of people have either chosen to use another cloud storage utility. Dropbox, for instance, may be an option for you. But either way, if you're not using the OneDrive utility, you may opt to disable it by simply right-clicking on the OneDrive app, which is located on your taskbar, and simply selecting Exit. Last but not least, I want to talk about Hibernation. Unless you're recording your lecture on a laptop like I am today, you may want to disable Hibernation on your desktop systems. You can do this, believe it or not, simply by going into the administrator command prompt. That means you gotta choose your command, open command prompt under administrator, and then you're going to have to type the following command: powerconfig space -h space off. So POWERCFG for powerconfig space -h space off. That's going to disable Hibernation on the system. Sometimes Hibernation tends to get in the way if you're distracted or something, and it's just for some users having Hibernation removed off the box can be very beneficial. Kind of my last little tip for the day. Alright, so let's do a quick review and then we're done. Installing Windows on a pre-built virtual machine process is virtually identical to installing on any physical box. There are times when we would like to build a bare metal box. Maybe we're going to install an operating system later. Maybe we're going to install another virtual machine drive later. Two options where building a bare metal box is appropriate. Another great utility is the VMware Tools. Since we're in the VMware piece of our series right now, VMware Tools is another great utility that will provide significantly enhanced capabilities on your VM. Things like host-guest interchangeability, or the ability to improve performance and help manage the VM. These are all great tools that VMware Tools can provide for you. Highly recommended for virtually any VM you create. Last but not least, Windows processes and features. There are lots of features. Each box is going to be different, and how you use that box is going to be different. But it's important to, when you first build your box, take time to optimize that box. Make sure you're getting the most out of that box from a resource perspective and from a security perspective by going in and disabling familiar things that you know you're not going to be using on the box. I'm going to do a how-to segment on some of that and show you firsthand how we can do that a little later on. Alright, well that's all I've got for today. So, I look forward to seeing you next week when we continue our lecture series on virtualization. We are going to be moving more into some of the hardware segments in the near future, discussing how how we can tweak some of the VMware hardware on the boxes, algorithms, and things like that. So, I look forward to seeing you soon.